everybody. I am an actual infrastructure specialist today. I'm with the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation, and when we developed this this presentation, Clarence worked with us at the corporation for this presentation. I've been with the corporation for about 10 years now, in different aspects with infrastructure specialists, and one of them is helping First Nations to better manage their construction projects on reserve, mainly their housing projects, and that's what this kind of presentation will look at, on how to better view your process and what to put into the process of securing and then fulfilling the objectives of your construction project management.
So yeah, my name is Clarence Mikas, like was introduced. I am from Deer Lake First Nation, so it's a remote community north of here, a couple hours flight. But I have worked at the FNHC, like Chuck mentioned, since 2003 till about 3 weeks ago. How does it go? I didn't get fired because slaves have to be sold. Is that what? No, I didn't get sold either. I left by my own free will. When they stop paying you, you kind of have to make a decision. No, I'm just kidding. You know what? I've enjoyed working with First Nations my whole career. You know, for the past 20 years. I moved here 20 years ago with my family to go to school and have an opportunity to work for First Nations. So this, and I work for Northern Chiefs Council, Q8 Nigukamakonik. It's about 6 remote communities. It is 6 remote communities north of here. The closest one might be Poplar Hill First Nation, North Spirit, Key-Wave, and even ones further north. Fort Severn First Nation is one of the other member communities, so that's right on the Hudson Bay coast, the furthest north community in Ontario. So there's a lot of challenges we see, and so Chuck and I have been many places across the country. We've seen many projects, many housing situations, and planning is probably one of the biggest things that we kind of rush into projects sometimes, and we're trying to meet the First Nation needs, and sometimes we don't always use the best planning practices, or we're not always as ready as we could be. So that's what the focus of this presentation is. We will be doing another one in the next session at the conference. It's in a different stream, I think the technical stream. So this is going to cover planning, a lot of considerations for planning. We invite your feedback. If you have questions or comments, we want to hear your experiences. And it makes it good for everybody when we can interact in that way and ask questions or provide your comments. So we welcome that completely. Just raise your hand or whatever, or throw something at us if we're not looking. Let's get into it then. Okay, so the topics for the presentation will be defining the needs. So how do you come to a project? Do you know what you need? And then we'll look at the plan. So how you approach your planning process, considerations for that. And then, like the topic says, the workshop pre-construction. So this is covering a lot of stuff until you're actually starting the project. And some of this stuff will be repeated as well, because when you're doing it, a lot of this stuff you come across, but you're actually doing it then. So define the need, the why. What do we need and why? Just answering basic questions, whether you're working with your community, working with your council, how do you approach the need? If somebody just offers you a housing project or an opportunity for, to increase your housing stock, what do you know that you're meeting the needs, the most critical needs that you have? And then looking at community planning, there's different processes. Some are government opportunities that we see. We see comprehensive community plans, capital planning studies, which look more at infrastructure. Comprehensive community plans often involve the community more, and you see a lot of socioeconomic stuff. And then just general meetings, like how do you hear, or how do you do community planning? And then there's strategic planning. If we're going through strategic planning processes with our community, we can see needs that come out of that kind of exercise. So these are kind of just a couple looks at how we view community planning. Comprehensive community plan will often look at the big picture of the whole community and everything involved. It could be infrastructure. Believe that on the left is an overview of the city of Thunder Bay. So it's the whole community, everything involved with its infrastructure, roads, where all the housing developments are, where the commercial or other institutional things might be, and then the more detailed look is housing plans, or in this case, a subdivision. How are you laying out? How are you laying out how you get up to your housing projects? Yeah.
So when we're looking at this planning process and this community comprehensive community planning process, you're bringing in consultants, and it's more of a visioning process to look at their needs, look at their, like, what you want to do, and then you prioritize those wants to narrow it down to what do we actually need. And it looks at the demographics. It looks at all of the those specific different kind of groups of individuals who may be looking for that type of housing, or those recreational facilities. And then it helps you to prioritize and provide vision for the community. And it actually puts a mission in place for your chief and council to actually strive towards something that the community wants, and work towards that as a common goal for everybody to achieve, growing in a healthy way, because it's what the people want. It's not what we think they need, right?
Multiple clicks here we got to do. Often just a differentiation. So Chuck talked about the comprehensive community plan. Often the capital planning study doesn't include things like socioeconomic issues or even economic development. So the comprehensive community plan process is often more community driven, where the capital planning study process is usually driven by ISC and focuses more on infrastructure for development. Also here we're explaining a bit more of the planning, or the ones that might be ISC.
So back to that comprehensive community plan, and it's that overall community level planning process where everybody's brought together and they individualize groups, right? You got the youth, you got the adults, the elders, leadership, band staff. They're all kind of pulled on direction on where we're going to go with our community and how we're going to grow it in a healthy way, right? So that's what this process does, and it's ongoing. So it's always updated every 5 years or 10 years, depending on what the community wants to do, on how they're going to do it, right? So it's all community driven, and that's the important part. You're getting input from your membership on how to grow, right? So more on the capital planning study, and I'm going to read it. It says it's intended to serve as a guideline for future planning and development over the next 20 years. And this project and report reviews existing assets, and it assesses the biophysical characteristics, it makes population projections, it determines housing requirements, and develops a land use plan. And then based on these assessments and population projections, the 20-year needs of the community will be determined by that process. And I think at this point, everybody should have had one done, a capital planning study. And you might be in a position where you need to update that capital planning study. If you go through this capital planning, comprehensive community planning process, it will make those determinations quite clear to you that we need to update our capital planning study, because they will use that capital planning study to influence their comprehensive community plan, to give it more direction on where it was supposed to go as opposed to where we want to go, right?
Stakeholder involvement, there's a lot of people that can and should be involved and maybe even shouldn't be involved depending on where you're at in your process of planning. So asking the question, who needs to be involved? Maybe at the community level should be the Public Works Department. You know that, if you're going to plan a subdivision or new housing, that you have the infrastructure, whether it's water, wastewater, or even available land space if you have to do on-site individual septic systems. The lands manager, if land is already designated for other use, or there's a school or another community center plan or something like that. So the land department needs to know. And then there's, if your land base if you're having challenges with space, how does that fit into your planning for housing? The housing department, of course, they will have a lot of information like needs for housing, your housing list, community membership. What, like Chuck mentioned, what are the needs of the community? What do they want for housing? It's not always practical to build 3 or 4 bedroom homes every time you build a home. And how are you getting that feedback? And then the finance department, if you have a financial opportunity, whether it's a government funding opportunity with ISC or Canada Mortgage and Housing, do your plans fit the available funding? If not, how is your finance department set up to consider other options? And there could very well be many other people involved. These are kind of all at the community level or within the community, but there could be other partners or other planning consultants and that kind of thing that will help, could help with this kind of process.
When you look at the needs that arise from your planning process, and who's involved in, at the stakeholder involvement level, you're going to determine what type of housing needs you have in your community. And you're looking at different housing, building different housing needs according to the needs of the people, right? So we're looking at different housing like flex housing, multi-unit housing, multiple family dwellings, and that includes like all family-sized homes will include generational homes where you have 3 or 4 families living together. So that planning process will determine that these families like to live together and they don't like to be separated and boxed up in individual homes. So we allow for them in this process to build a house that's going to accommodate them for generations. Right? So you have a large enough house or home for them to grow for different generations to come. Right? So through this whole process, at some point you have to consider the people that want to move home and live. And how do you look after that? How do you look after those wants? They've been living in the city for so long, they're ready to retire, they want to move back to the community and help in any way that they can, but we don't have the housing. Or we have to look at them and say, okay, well, we already have needs in the community, so how do we look after them? And we determine that, all right, so as a committee, as a community, let's start a list and we'll put them on a list, but it might be different for different communities, right? So they need to work together on how they're going to implement this waiting list, and then look at how we're going to manage it and how we're going to maintain that list so that it's not getting cluttered, with people who aren't ready to build, who aren't ready to leave, to move into their own home yet, but they still want to be on that list in case there's an opportunity for them to move on, right? So that determines how you're going to update your list. You know, some communities, they'll put a general call out for those interested in just rental units, right? Here's a letter, here's a form letter on our website, download it, sign it, send it in, we'll put you on a list, right? And then it's first come, first serve. You're first on the list, but then the type of housing that's available will make them more eligible for that unit that's become available. So you need to be able to work together as a community to look at that different demographic and family sizes, and this next slide will have us look at those.
The other considerations bullet is just, do you keep a different list for renovations requests? Or and another consideration is, how about young couples? How do you look at your needs or track your needs that way? Do you have a different list, or is it just checking a box on the top of the application form that says, yes, it's an overcrowding issue, or we need upgrades, or we need a new home? People that, like Chuck mentioned, are waiting, they would like to move back to the community. So other considerations, but having a list, and how many people in their communities have some kind of waiting list and process. So most communities do in some way or another. But updating it is important. Do you update it annually or every 6 months? Because people change, times change, their needs change. So how do you make sure you have the latest information, that so your planning process can happen appropriately? Oh, okay. So some of the selection criteria, if you're looking at, how do you select what people for, whether it's renovations or for a new home in your housing policy? Hopefully you have a housing policy. Is that addressed in how you approach selecting tenants or occupants or people for renovations or upgrades? Things to consider in your criteria, family, household size. There might be, like Chuck mentioned, multiple generations, so it's not just always the family that you see or know right away that might be the core family, but are they other people, or are they in a family care situation where they're caring for other relatives? Current living conditions, where do you live now? Are you in the community? Are you with family, or are you outside the community? So all these are factors. Current income level, that helps decide your need and how you approach, whether somebody wants a new home, a large 4 or 5 bedroom home, are they able to afford the utilities, and even the cost of maintaining the home. Prior tenancy, have they been good tenants in the past, or do they have a history of, not being able to manage the place that they live well? Can be a challenge. So those are all things to consider. And here's just an example of one selection criteria table. Often you'll see like a point system. So for every criteria, there'll be conditions. So like number 1 says number of full-time occupants in the current dwelling, and then you get a point each. So it's kind of a scoring system, and you add it up. Item 2 says number of occupants that are under 18. So, or it could be over 60. So you want to make sure that you're aware of youth and elders in the homes. The current living conditions, the current dwelling poses a health and safety hazard, health and or safety risk to the occupants, supported by documentation such as, so that, working with the rest of your housing department or the tribal council for your tech unit staff, and getting into the units and providing feedback, pictures, things like that. And again, you apply the scoring. So there's considerations, all of these, and household income. Applicant has a total debt service ratio of less than 40%. So you take their monthly income, whether it's household income or primary occupant income, and look at their debt and make sure that there's enough space in their month-to-month living expenses and income to be able to live within or live in a new unit or handle utilities and things like that, maintenance items that are or should be the home occupant's responsibility. So As far as we know, all these presentations are put onto the conference website, so they would be available for downloading later. So you should be able to, within a few days, to go back to the website and download the presentations. So other considerations might be looking at how many people are band members in the homes. Applicants, are they able to provide references to you for prior tenancy? That's a good consideration. Let's see. Item 3 and other says 1 point for each year that the applicant has had an active application on file to a maximum of 5 points. So, sometimes our housing is not always geared toward the needs of the community. So if it's an older single person or a young couple and you're always building 4-bedroom homes, it's not always appropriate to have one person living. So naturally, they're not going to always be at the top of the list, in the scoring, because that helps in our planning process. Are we building appropriately if we're building row housing or 1 or 2 bedroom units to reflect the needs of the community?
So having a look back at the overall community level planning process, historically, it didn't always include the economic development considerations that come from growth in that area. But you're looking at the base year where the alternatives are generally analyzed and cost estimates prepared. They're usually prepared for the following infrastructure details that the band has to consider: the water supply, the treatment and distribution, future fire protection needs, sewage collection, the treatment and the disposal of that sewage, your solid waste, same thing, right? It adds to the cost of the amount of growth that you're including when you develop new homes, new subdivisions. So your whole planning process has to include all of that, or be looked at during the planning process to include all of these different elements of growth. In your residential development, your subdivisions, where are you going to build that next subdivision? And you're looking forward in that process to, using all of that information that's gained through the feasibility studies that have been completed during your your comprehensive community planning process. If your comprehensive community planning process includes those, right? So that makes a difference on the depth that you're looking at on how to grow healthy in the future. So, then you got to look at your electrical power requirements for the community, and how that's going to grow, how that's going to affect the cost of growth in your community. So you have to be able to look at those things objectively and say, is this feasible for us to grow in that area? Or do we have to scale back, move over here, and wait until we can find enough funding from those funding agencies to develop in that area? So the planning process will include all of that. So even like with the community group that have to happen, and so I mentioned, these new subdivisions, where we're going to put them, and have we used up all of our, in our land use plan. Normally it will determine where these residential areas are going to be developed in the future. So, we're in here, we've got 2 lots left and we've got 5 houses to build. What are we going to do? Do we have a plan in place to develop that new subdivision to put the other 3 units, right? And then as we grow, we have to continue building that subdivision. And is that the right place? Your planning process will make that determination for you that yes, it's a feasible place to move. So you have to be able to plan for all of that. And then that new infrastructure that you're going to need for those new developments, those new community subdivisions that are going to be developed. You got to look at the water, wastewater, your electricity, your roads, and it says here the heating capacity, and I'm not sure what that is relating to. I don't know.
Could be, I know I've been familiar with some communities where they're limited by the electrical capacity, and if you're heating by baseboard electric baseboards, then that's a big consideration. I've seen communities with, a dozen homes not connected to the grid or power because they were at capacity, whether they were running on diesel generators. Another community I was aware of was having a dispute with Hydro One, and they weren't connecting new services. So there's a lot to consider, not just the fact that you want to build housing, but what are the infrastructure needs and requirements.
So other considerations you want to look at in your growth is your land tenure. And, we have a definition here, or a quote from Wikipedia. So land tenure is the legal regime in which land is owned by an individual or community who is said to hold the land. It determines who can use land and for how long and under what conditions. Tenure may be based on based both on official laws and policies and on informal customs. So land tenure designations can include certificates of possession, certificates of occupation, leased lands, and First Nations owned lands. So that's something that really needs to be considered when you're looking at your community growth. Families might hold land in that area, and you have to negotiate to be able to use that land. But, are you willing to do that? Or is the family willing to do that for the community growth? So those are important considerations that have to be taken into consideration to move forward. So the financial viability of growth, do we have a sufficient financial support to consider our plans? When you get into this planning process, in this visioning, everybody wants, they want the big rink, they want the new school, they want the new band office, they want all of these new assets for the community to grow. Is it financially viable for us to do that? How do we look at it objectively and consider those parameters that, we might not be able to afford this, and where do we scale back? And do we look for other sources of funding? Who do we go to? Who do we talk to? Those things start to become pretty important considerations when you're looking at growth in your community. And the other big one that we all have to deal with is these ministerial loan guarantees. How do we deal with them? Do we want to get back into them? Do we want to continue to do them? Right, so they become considerations that have to be looked at in your planning process. So the plan, what, when, who, where, how.
No, it's just approaching the planning process. Sorry. These are questions that you think about when you're looking at making a plan or doing planning, and we'll go through these subsequent slides. So the plan. So we've talked about community planning that looks at housing, infrastructure, economic development. What do we want? And then you apply your priorities. Like Chuck said, do you want the community center first, or do you need to increase your housing stock or do renovations? Is your housing stock older, where you're focusing more on renovations programs, or can you do both at the same time? And then, you have to consider your funding opportunities, whether it's, it still says INAC, ISC, CMHC programs, or other, there's like the Market Housing Fund. There's other major banks that do have funding programs available for First Nations communities, and own source funding. So it can be a mix of all of these things that we have to work and plan together to make projects happen. So everybody knows this statement. If you fail to plan, essentially, you plan to fail. So what kind of exercises? It even applies day to day at times. How do we approach our days? Because many of us know, as housing-related people, there's always so many things to do. We have 10 things to do every day, and we have time to do 5. How do we apply priority in our planning? And the 7 the 7 P's. And that is proper prior planning prevents piss poor performance. We didn't put it up on the screen, but I don't know, something I heard in different project management teaching, and something that I remembered for sure. So the plan, so how do we approach the plan? What is our plan? What is a statement that we might say might be the focus of our planning process? So how do you state your goals? The plan is to build 10 homes in 26 weeks or 6 months or 7 months. And we have prepared by completing lot servicing, getting detailed drawings and plans, employing community members, purchasing material packages with X or O supply company. So that's a statement, and I think that's like a common goal and a core value that everybody should learn to see and look at for the project, and that's where you want to end up. So be smart. Just looking at the planning process, your goals or your plan, the goals should be specific. That means that an objective can answer the questions, the who, what, why, when, where, and how. What needs to be done? Why should we do it? Who's involved with accomplishing the plan or the goal? Where can we get the necessary resources? So it needs to be specific in that sense. How are we approaching? Should be measurable. How do we know when we're done? We have a 5-year housing plan or a 10-year housing plan, and we're going to build 45 homes. We're going to renovate 75 homes, or whatever the case might be. But getting a plan in place, a long-term plan. How do you measure? How do you know when you're done? Attainable. So, our planning shouldn't be so sky high that it's beyond everybody's imagination. I mean, that's often how people help start the planning process. Imagine you had no budget, no limits on resources, you had all the money in the world. What would you do? You'd build that arena or community center, health center, you'd build a brand new school, you'd build 40 new homes, or you'd build a seniors living complex, that kind of thing. But what could be manageable? What is manageable for council in that time frame, or the housing department? What are the skills? Do you need outside help to reach those goals? So, and relevant, are we meeting the needs that we have today? If there's a lot of youth, are we focused on housing needs that meet their needs, or housing goals that meet their needs? Oh, sorry. Time bound. So do we have a schedule, or are we able to guide our planning process and the project process within a reasonable time? It can't just, your 1-year plan shouldn't take 6 years to achieve. And you're working through the planning process will help you decide that. And just another, what do you call these, acronyms? Or there's another word for them. But so having clear goals, the plan, collaborative, so that's including stakeholders at every level, whether it's the youth and elders, the community membership, could be government, funding agencies, outside consultants, and so many people. Limited. What is the scope? Is it just anything goes in our planning process, or is it specific to housing or community-sized housing? Emotional. How are we engaging the community membership? We can take pride in a lot because we ask people for their ideas, but if we don't know what the ideas of the people are, or the feedback, or even the complaints, what do people really, it's not just, rants on social media or something like that, how do we hear or listen to the community properly when we're considering our planning and goals? And the last one's refinable. So it spells clear. Are we able to refine the plans to meet our changing needs? Over the past, well, even in the past 30 and 40 years, we've seen community membership increase because of changes in legislation. So that changes our goals and planning process immensely sometimes, because suddenly we have, 15% more membership overall. How do we consider their needs and the opportunities that those new members might look to have in the community? So there's different ways to look at how you move or approach a project, what project approach fits for us or for our community. First Nations management. So the First Nation essentially is the general contractor. They do all of the looking for, say, supply packages from lumber companies, getting the plans. They might, get the subcontractors. Or do we hire a general contractor and just say, you know what, get so-and-so company from Winnipeg or Thunder Bay or Sudbury, and you guys just give us the keys at the end of the day and we'll pay you, and we'll make a project management plan that includes scheduling and costing and things like that. So you're paying essentially somebody to oversee the whole project. And you might have an agreement that includes stuff like staffing, First Nations, employment opportunities. Design build is another project approach you often see. For housing projects, it tends to be more costly, but it's just an option out there that you see sometimes.
So looking deeper into the plan and looking at the different aspects that you should consider during your planning process, looking at your plan. And each of these constraints will affect one or all of the other different constraints that come in your planning process. So you should be defining your scope, the scope of your project, and what it actually includes to complete your project. So the entire scope of work will do that for you. So if you do that in an appropriate way, right, we're planning not to fail here. So all of these things should be considerations. And if there's other ones that you want to include into it, then in your community, you're going to add that to your planning process so that it's not overlooked in that process. So you want to look at the cost, the scheduling. You want to look at the different risks that might be involved, and look at how you're going to manage those different risks. And if there's political unrest in the community, that might shut down projects for a considerable amount of time. So you want to, consider that in your planning process, that we're getting close to election time for this project. We might be delayed. We might lose 2-3 weeks during this process. But if we put it in the planning process and we consider that, then we're mitigating that risk for cost overruns and project delays. So we're being proactive in our process. And then, human resources, who's working on the project? Are we hiring? Who's responsible for doing that hiring process? And what part does everybody who's involved in the project, what part of the project are they responsible for? And do they understand that that responsibility fully and wholly? And are they willing to accept those responsibilities? So we need to make sure that everybody's on board. We don't need anybody on our projects to just all of a sudden say, no, I can't handle that. I'm going to walk away, right? So that's part of your risk management process too, right? Do they have the capacity to handle this part of the project? And if not, then what do we need to put in place so that if it breaks down in that part of the process or in that part of the project, can we manage that without any delays? So these are the considerations: the quality of the project, like the building materials, the finished product, How is that being managed? Who's assuring that the community is getting what they defined in their scope? Who's responsible for doing that? And then, the policies and the communication in your projects, right? What is our policy when it comes to hiring? What is our policy when it comes to payments? What is, do we have those things in place so that our project doesn't run out of control? Do we have that finance policy that looks at paying contractors, or is it in our hiring policy to look at making sure that our staff, our trained, skilled laborers, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, are they being considered when we go into building our new homes? And then communication. Who's responsible for doing that? Who's responsible for communicating to the public, right? There's health and safety risks that, that should be considered when you got a big, giant open hole and you got kids running around the reserve. They could get hurt. I know as a kid, that's what I did. As soon as there's a big hole, a big pile of sand, that's where you go, right? As a child. Right? And you want to have fun and you don't know the risk. So, through risk management in your planning process, you're looking at all of these different considerations. Okay? So we'll get deeper in. The scope. And these are the questions that you should be asking yourself, right? And what it says, is we should be specific when it comes to scope. What kind of trim, baseboard trim, and do we want it caulked after it's installed? Those are specifics. Those are specifications that should be printed out in the scope of work. If you expect it and you don't put it into your scope, he doesn't have to do it. Right? Your contractor can just walk away, nail it, and walk away. But you want it finished a certain way, right? You want the nail holes covered. You want the caulking installed properly. You want the paint to be flawless. Like all of these things, you want all the cover plates on. You want your smoke alarms to work, right? You have to make sure that it's in the scope of work. Yeah, let's move on. So we're looking at your time or the schedule of the project. One more. All right. So scheduling, your timelines. When do you want your tenants to move in, right? When do you want the project to start? When does our construction season start? Or how soon can we get in the ground to get it started? Or do we just go? Because that consideration starts to affect the cost of the project, and those timelines can get dragged out. The weather, those sorts of things. So there's always a kind of a high-level schedule and a project schedule. So we're going to show you a couple of samples on looking at these timelines that should be considered. So your project doesn't run over time, or it doesn't go out of budget, those sorts of things. So, and then who maintains the schedules? Who is responsible for maintaining the schedule? And that's all looked at in this planning process, so that your projects run on time, on budget, and your members actually get into the house when you tell them they're going to get into it. Yeah. So you're not going to be able to read this, but this is a sample of a Gantt chart that project managers might use, right, to look at their projects on how we're going to move forward. We can't start this until this is done, but while this is happening, we can start this, right? So it's planned in a way that the project manager understands, and he'll be able to keep the project moving forward without any delays. You know, we've considered all the risks. We have the scope of work. He knows how it has to be done. Now he can put his schedule in place, and through the process of meeting with him and him updating you, you know, these sorts of things will look at ensuring that the community in the First Nation, you know, and mainly leadership, the ones who signed the check, understand that this project is on schedule, it's meeting its timelines, its milestones, and we're going to be able to be successful in completing this project.
There was this reference to critical path and non-critical path. So that's, in this case, it's these red things along the schedule. So that means that the next major item can't start or can't finish until those previous items are done. It's like, you know, doing your rough-in plumbing, your rough-in electrical, or your rough-in heating, running your venting or your ducts. You can't do your drywall and painting before you finish the rough-ins. So that's the critical path. So your rough-in stuff for your servicing is critical path related, where say if you have a crawl space or a basement, you know, if you put the rough-in stuff and they're doing drywall upstairs, the guy can be finishing the ducting downstairs or that type of thing. So some of that finishing work might not be critical path where the rough-in stuff is, and that's just looking at the differentiation.
So this is a higher level sample of a schedule of completion dates that might work better for those people in the office who have to address the project team, which might include the chief, counselors. You know, they want to know how's our project. They might not want to know, but you should be ensuring that they understand that this project is on time. It looks to be like we're on budget. We're getting regular updates from the project management team, the project manager, or the construction manager, whoever you put in place to look after your project. They'll have those details, and they should be monitoring those details for you so that you can inform those in charge of releasing money, that they understand that everything is going according to plan. So you can see in that, sorry, Clarence, go back. It goes from like different phases of the project here, but you can modify it so that it's easier for you to understand. These are just samples we took off the internet, right? And then it's got years, but you could put weeks or months depending on the length of your project. So looking at the cost during this process, are we following a budget? What are my processes in regards to making sure that this budget is being followed? How do we update or incorporate changes into and adjustments into our costing model or our cost for the project? And what do we do to approve changes to the budget with respect to those changes? And, you know, there should always be a mechanism put in place so that if there's a change that is wanted, can we afford it? If we can afford it, okay, well, let's do a change order because the contractor now needs to know, because it will affect his budget. It will affect his timelines. And is it feasible to do that? You know, projects run, people come in, they have authority, but they're not given that authority for this particular project. They'll come in and say, well, no, can you do this instead of doing that? And, you know, contractors are going to say, sure, because he'll just bill you for the extra work or for the extra material. It's, you know, unless there's something in place that says there's no change orders and they have to be approved by this person, nobody else has authority to make those changes. So we want to make sure that we're looking at our cost that way so that it's always being monitored, it's always being approved for the expenses during the project. So a little bit into the risk management of your project, and Clarence says a little blurb there. It says, "Chance favors the prepared." And when you're mitigating risk and you're looking at risk during the project, you want to evaluate these risks. You want to rank them. You want to develop mitigation measures, for the high or most likely risks, if possible. And then some risks you might not be able to mitigate them. So what do? You might have a protest. It shuts down the work. You can't mitigate that. You can't plan for that. It's just going to happen. So what do we do?
Some other considerations like the labor force availability could be if your labor force is almost all from the community and there's a death in the community, everybody, everything shuts down for 2 days, or you might be working, or the project might cover the Christmas holiday, the office closure. How is that addressed if it's a general contractor or people from outside the community? How do they work with that? So it's risk in that way, and even risks like, if you're doing a 10-unit project and you have an electrical contractor, he guaranteed you up front, there'll be 2 or 3 crews available all the time, so nobody has to wait. And then you get to, framing, and you're ready for all the rough-in electrical work, and there's 3 guys trying to do 10 homes, so everybody's stuck waiting. So there's risk, looking at the risks that way. Sometimes I've told communities, make sure that the electrical contractor knows in their contract if people are stuck waiting because of his worker availability or not being able to keep up, we can take funds from their agreement and hire other help as needed to do the other electrical work. I mean, there's different ways that you can mitigate risk or manage it and not create issues for everybody else on the project. Could be plumbers, could be the heating guys. There's all different things to consider in that, or that we can consider.
So health and safety in a project, you want to look at who's responsible. Ultimately, the First Nation is responsible. The owner is responsible. But on the site, you want to ensure that those in charge understand health and safety on a job site. The personal protective equipment and those sorts of things. So that you're mitigating the risk of injury on the work site, which could cause delays during your project and could lead to, further implications, which we won't get into. So you want to make sure that the supervisors know their expectations. They want to make sure that, in the plan they've got site meetings and they're doing health and safety reviews, and that the contractor understands, the expectations. And that they're having their safety meetings and they're keeping, appropriate records, training records of people. Do they have fall arrest? Do they have all of the necessary training that they're going to require to do the work that they need to do, right? And if they don't, then you have to look at that in a different way on how do we move forward, right? So human resources, roles and responsibilities. You have chief and council, you have the housing authority, the committee, the community members, contractors, subcontractors, the housing manager / housing project, the project manager, the carpenters, the laborers, suppliers. What is their role? What is their responsibility? Do they understand their role? Do they understand their responsibility? All of these things should be made very clear at the beginning of the project so that they know this is what you're responsible for, and you're going to be held accountable to it so that, your project doesn't run into any issues, So who are the decision makers? The chief and council, the decision makers, the housing authority or the committee. The community members have a direct role. And what if they do? How do you look at that? How will this work in the planning phase, day, have a role for sure. So they need to understand that. And everybody on the project should understand who's responsible for that. You know, you don't need people running around, well, he was supposed to order this, he was supposed to do that, he was supposed to make that payment. And it causes delays and frustration on the site, and we don't need that for our project. Quality. It's better to do the right thing with intention than to do the wrong thing quickly. Working on job sites for a long time and projects for a long time in my past, I've had over 30 years working on construction sites in different capacities and working in First Nations. One of the things I've always kept close is, you know, if it was mine, would I want it done that way? And if I want to get good at it, I'm going to take my time, learn to do it right, and then I'll get good at it, and then I'll get efficient at doing it, and then it'll be effective work, and it'll look good. Right? So instilling those ethics into workers to keep that in mind when they're doing their work, you know. And then you want to look at different things when it comes to quality. The quality of the record keeping for the project, you know. Are they keeping those receipts? Are they, you know, signing their documents when they have to? Those sorts of things. Materials. Is it good material? Are we getting, you know, we told we were getting this, but they shipped this. Is that acceptable to you on a job site? And to me, it's not. That's not what you ordered. And they're going to charge you for what you ordered and give you something of a lesser value. So you need to be aware that, you know, who's going to look after that, those materials, and how they're accepted on site, the workmanship, how well is it installed, who's responsible for doing that, you know, what's the best practice in our community? Is that acceptable anymore? Do we want to raise our best practice? Do we want to look at different ways of doing things? Are we following the manufacturer specifications? It affects the warranties of those manufactured appliances, those manufactured installed, what do you call them? Like a tub surround, you know. I was looking at one, you know, 3 weeks ago, and the contractor told the homeowner that no, that's how they're installed now, right? And I told him that's not how you install. That's not a quality completed project, right? If that's what he's saying, then the manufacturer should have installation procedures that should be followed. But now he has to prove it. If he doesn't prove it, he has to tear it out and redo it. So that's assuring quality, you know, on your projects, right? And then your performance measurements. How are we tracking the schedule, scope changes, and costs? So managing the performance of your project, right? It should be managed. Who's doing that, and understanding that role.
Sorry, there's so many clicks built into our thing, we can't. All right, so policy. What policies do I have? What policies do we have in the community? What policies do we need? Do we need, an example would be if you have community members that are laborers on the project, whether they're hired by the contractors, the general contractor, or they are community, they are under the ban policy for employment. How does that affect their hours of work? Do you need a different policy, say for seasonal workers? Because most construction during the season will be 10, 12 hours a day. And if your ban policy says, yeah, we're here from 8:30 to 4:30, we're off for an hour at lunch, that kind of thing. So the workers and the community and the general contractors need to know what policies you have that cover employment. And then, you know, there's so many policies that we see needed out there. So housing policy, which we've talked about, procurement, how do we get other contractors or building suppliers or subcontractors to come in? How do we buy materials? How do we buy housing packages? How do we buy servicing or get servicing agreements? Some procurement policies come from the government. If you're utilizing CMHC or ISC funding, they might have a procurement policy that says you need 3 bids on anything that's could be valued over 50,000 or 30,000 or who knows. You need to follow other processes at times, even if you have your own, if you're utilizing other partner funding. Tendering, how do we get contractors to bid? Do we get them to bid? Do we issue requests for proposals? Do we have the scope of work and enough information that they need? Are we able to issue complete plans so they can do their estimating and costing for the tender or the bidding? Contractor or vendor policies, how do we maintain appropriate relationships with contractors or vendors? Might be something like people that might do the water connections. It could be somebody different than your staff or the general contractor, or even like hydro connections, power connections. Often there's a lot of lead time needed to make sure you have access to power. What's that process? What do we need to be aware of? Who's responsible? We can say to a general contractor, you guys are responsible to make sure you have access to power, that you get it there. But there's also agreements, say from Hydro One or the ESA, that anything financial still has to remain with the intended owner of the property. But there are form letters you can sign here. This so-and-so general contractor or electrical company can sign for us for permits and approvals and that kind of stuff, and they can be the main contact for inspectors to visit, that kind of thing. So there's a lot you can stick handle through and need to be aware of. And I did mention the seasonal worker policy that could be different than the others, and the First Nations employee policy. Sometimes it has to be different. Sometimes general contractors, they might manage the employees, but then they invoice the band for the employee labor month to month. So how is that going to work? That protects, the band and makes sure the contractors have what they need for staffing. Communications. So considerations and how you communicate. How do you communicate with chief and council, or how do chief and council communicate with the project team? Can they just show up whenever they feel like it and say whatever they want, or take half your crew away because something came up at a different site or a renovation or another home? So what's appropriate? Again, community members, workers, how do you provide comments or feedback and that kind of thing with all of these stakeholders? The project team, how do they communicate with council, like we said, or the housing department, the GC, the builders, contractors, subcontractors? So all these, of course, are people involved in the project, but how do we spell it out a way to stay in touch that doesn't leave anybody outside the loop? Suppliers are important to know how communication happens with them, whether it's government agency, funding agencies. We need to know what's the proper way to make sure that everybody knows what they need to, when they need to know it. Just looking at different types of construction. So we have conventional wood framing. So it's using studs, and we're just pretty much manufacturing the whole home on site. We're just getting big supply packages from a lumber yard, and we have a full materials list, and everything shows up either on trucks in the winter or on planes or that kind of thing, and we have them in storage. Manufactured homes is something you see a lot of. You can have a home ready to move into probably within a week to 10 days. When you connect the servicing, if you've prepared the lots, if there's any foundation needs that have been taken care of beforehand. So it's often making sure the electrical's connected, and any heating and water servicing, sewer servicing are the last things to be done in manufactured homes. There can be other innovative construction types. Some of the ones you see out there are structurally insulated panels. I've worked in many communities that have utilized that type of construction, or ICF, insulated concrete forms. Again, that requires access to, or easier access to concrete. Log built, manufactured, or conventional. So there's many options for how we move through construction and the construction types. So plans and drawings, what are we getting? What do we expect? What are we asking for? We always like to see a complete set of drawings, and that can mean different things for different people. Myself, I like to see, that there's enough details, enough sections in the set of plans so that all the questions can be answered about how the construction detail is, whether it's at corners or insulation or window sections and details, how the windows should be installed. The building codes do specify a certain way that should be done. And then there's best practice stuff also that can apply. And we talked about specifications, which could go even beyond the building code requirements, because if we want the best, then we need to be able to specify that. An architect can be involved. It tends to be, can be more costly, but there are other, you can have, it says other approved or certified designers, somebody who's been trained in the building code process and is an approved designer, whether it's in the ministry approval process or some professional association. Many times you'll get a set of plans from the lumberyard or the supplier. They have standard forms that they use, but does it include everything? If you update the layout, are they able to give you the modifications? We're going to move these closets or move these doorways or change the windows. You want to make sure the updates or the stuff that you're requesting can be updated through an approved set of plans. Engineered components. So today's homes, we see many engineered parts. Could be the set of trusses, could be engineered floor joists. So making sure you get the proper design documents for those and the layouts as part of your plans. And then special situations, is there so the stuff we seen last night for the Community Showcase Awards, Fort Severn, they use those tri-detic steel frames. What are the requirements for that kind of construction? And what are the characteristics we need to pay attention to in that might affect the design?
So in our pre-construction phase, we want to consider all of these different standards and codes that we've accepted in our communities, or that will apply to construction and construction products. And some of them are listed here. The Ontario Building Code, the National Building Code, and there's other provincial building codes that could be applicable. There's the CSA approved materials and appliances that have to be used or need to have that standard provided on the particular product, so that we know that it can be used in this application. The ESA, the Electrical Safety Authority, they'll normally leave a stamp, for you to know that it's been inspected and that it's been approved to go forward. And, some of our contractors have that pre-approval to just go forward and get things done. They don't need to call them every time they do a little project. So you might not see it until the end of the project, until there's a hookup. Once it's hooked up, there should be that sticker, that ESA little brown or black and orange sticker with the number on it to approve that application, that installation. Then there's other ones that can be considered wet for wood heating installations. Wood energy transfer, technology transfer. And there's different individuals in your tribal councils or here at the OFNTSU who are certified by WET to do those installation assessments. And, the HRAI, for air handling equipment, checking them, balancing them, making sure that they're installed properly. Those things have to be considered, when we think about mold and, prevention of mold and, buildup of ice in our windows. And, the house is designed to not allow that to happen. So we have to consider that when it comes to construction or pre-construction, to making sure that it's applied to the design of the home. And then your HVI sticker on all of your appliances that either exhaust or supply and exhaust air to the home, so that mechanical ventilation is done properly. Excuse me. And then there's material specifications acceptable for use in Ontario and in Canada. We're talking about the BMEC, the BMEC, and the CCMC documents that are provided on the websites. Is it for the Ontario Ministry of Municipal Housing? Right. So those are documents that, you can refer to. If it's got that sticker on the box, you see the number, you can actually go online to check that it's actually certified for what it's supposed to be. So you need to be able to understand that at a certain level, so that you're getting products that and materials that are designed and tested for the Canadian environment. So pre-construction, looking at the different agreements that we have in place. And then we're looking at the contracts, the request for proposals, the tender, the lump sum, the cost plus, the PM, the supervisor. Do we have all of those agreements in place for each of them to understand their roles and responsibilities? Is it specified in there for them? We want to have our agreements. We want to have everything reviewed by our legal representation, so that we know that it will hold up in court if it goes that way. We want to have mitigate all the liability that the band or the First Nation, that we're looking after the best interest of our people that way. We want to make sure that our insurances are looked after. Our contractors should all have insurance. We want to get construction insurance for our development, so that, if materials go missing, it's covered under an insurance policy, so that it can be replaced immediately to try and mitigate those delays. Our First Nation, do we have the proper insurance for our projects, and what are they, right? Do we have security for our construction site? Is it the general contractor's responsibility? Do the subs have any role to play in that? That site security might be crucial in some communities, and some communities might not need it. It should be considered.
Just a consideration on the insurance for contractors. If you're in a general contractor situation and you're saying, you guys get all the materials and you give us the keys when you're done, and we'll pay you for the homes or the project. So who owns the material until you get the keys? Contractor? So you want to, that certainly could be the case, and it would be the case in that situation. So I was involved in a project where, through some really unfortunate situation, a whole bunch of the building materials got burned where they were stockpiled. So who had to pay for it? And then finding out that the contractor didn't have the right insurance for the project. So the band ended up having to find other money to replace the materials in order to make sure the project kept moving, rather than delaying the project for months or years potentially to go through the legal part of it. And I'm sure that happened after the fact, but sometimes you still got to keep things moving in that sense. So, are you making sure that the contractors, people coming to the communities, have the appropriate insurance in place, whether it's general liability, insurance for errors on emissions and WSIB clearances, that kind of thing.
So we looked at the different documents that can be referenced. The CCMC is a document that comes from the Canadian Construction Materials Centre, and it provides an opinion on whether a construction product or a system complies with the requirements of the National Building Code of Canada, either as an acceptable solution or an alternative solution, or a combination of both. Acceptable solutions are those that comply with the code's applicable requirements, and the code allows the use of alternative solutions provided demonstration can be made that they achieve at least the minimum level of performance required by the objectives and functional statements attributed to the code's applicable acceptable solutions. Do you understand that?
Basically, it's a proofing process that the government mandates. So like even yesterday, the trade show, we had nearly 60, maybe it was more than 60 trade show exhibitors, a lot of materials, a lot of innovative construction materials. There were materials here and innovative construction materials here that didn't have this government certification yet. So anytime a new material comes out, they apply to the government for this kind of review, and you can pull it up. There's a file number, and every supplier or manufacturer of a material can give you the document for the very specific material, whether it's a special insulation. Even if you look on a bag of insulation, you'll find the CCMC document number, and you can look it up, and you can look at their approval process and see what it was approved for. Is it approved for, say, Zone 3 in the building code, which is far north where there could be permafrost, or it's restricted to Zone 1 and 2. It'll say all the stuff like that. And the next slide also is another look at approval process of materials, and it'll say if it's under review, if it's not approved yet, if it's not defined yet for the final uses or application. It could be even products like how you do spray on application membranes or something for waterproofing or damp proofing on exterior walls. So there's documents you can reference or look up that will give you and spell it out for you. And there were materials here that weren't approved yesterday. That happens. You see it at every trade show. So those are things to be aware of if somebody comes around. Yes, this is the latest and greatest material. You get a discount if you use it in your project. That kind of thing. So there's ways to make sure that you're getting appropriate materials.
So we're getting closer to actually getting in the ground. We want to make sure we have our plans or our drawings done, completed. We want to look at making sure that the site plan is completed. Our floor plans, our layouts, where the walls are going to go, the sections and the details, as Clarence had mentioned earlier. In our drawings, that's what we want to see. As inspectors, we want to make sure that that they're building it to code, and that it's acceptable. And we want to look at those plans before the project begins so that we can, prevent that delay during construction. This is how it was supposed to be built, and then the drawings will tell that contractor that that's how it has to be built. Now, if they make that change, well, then it's deficient, right? So it'll give you window and door details, size of doors, types of doors, design of the doors, structural details and notes, if they prefer built-up beam construction in the construction layout, and then specifications, general and specific, and it'll give you those specifications on the design of the wall, how you have to construct that wall, from the outside right to the inside finish. So we want to make sure that our drawings all include all of that. And then going on to the continuation of the drawings, you want to try and get them to do an electrical layout, a plumbing or sketch layout. If you can, get an HVAC layout from the heating contractor, and then the HRV installation. And you want to ensure that they, have that HRAI certification to design and install, so that you're not getting something that you're paying for that's going to have to be changed, right after they install it, or cause that delay because that's an inappropriate appliance for this application. So we want to make sure that they're all detailed in the drawings before moving forward with construction and ordering of materials. There's other manufacturer details that have to be considered: trusses, flush floor joists, attic ventilation. All of these things have to be considered. And innovative construction specifications, for your SIPs and your ICF and your log homes, and those suppliers have their own details on how it has to be installed. There's manufacturer specifications that have to be followed in order for it to be compliant, because it's designed that way by their engineers, and we're just going there to ensure that it has been. Okay. So looking at the different types of projects and agreements that we could put in place before we move forward into our building process, right? So we're looking at tendering this out, or we're looking for a request for proposals. We give them, here's what we want, send us what you can do and how much it's going to cost us. And then if it falls into our budget line, then it's a consideration that we might want to look at. Are we sole sourcing all of the different components of the contract, of the construction process? Are we doing a cost plus? Are we doing a design build, a standing offer? All of that should be in place before we, put a shovel in the ground. And then we get into what is a contract, what does it mean, and what are its implications. So if you look at a contract, it's a written agreement between two parties, but it has to be a mutual understanding so that it's beneficial to both on either side of that agreement. So that's why it becomes mutual. And you go into it voluntarily. If you're forced or coerced into it, then it's not mutually understandable. And then deliberate and competent, right? So the agreement, I don't know what we meant by deliberate, I can't remember. But you have to be competent to sign the agreement. Coherent. Yeah. So you don't want people, who are just rushing into something and don't understand what they're doing just to sign documents. You want to make sure that they're competent and then they understand. It does put you into a legal obligation at this point when you sign that document and both parties have signed it, and it becomes completely enforceable in court. And once we've got all of that looked at and our plan is complete, then we're looking at moving on to the construction phase. I don't think we have any time for questions. Okay, we got time. Are there any questions? All right. Oh, we have a question. they're going to restrict him on what he's going to be able to do on the project for sure, right? And, you know, looking at his own liability, you know, he would only hire people that are qualified to do the work. Yeah. Yeah. It's an investment in your people, right? And how many projects are you going to have that he's going to need that? But you're also looking at, okay, well, if he got this one to get started, they might hire him on to continue working for them if he's got the proper aptitude. Right. It's very specified training, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Or what do they provide? Sometimes you take training beforehand.
Yeah. Oh, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm not aware of any that's specific to smaller projects or First Nation projects. So, but you mentioned the PMP, professional project manager. That is one avenue that many people take. So, and
Thanks very much. Thanks.